good afternoon, good evening, whatever hour of the day it happens to be where you are. Welcome to the 8th annual Jeffrey Plevin Memorial Lecture. The Plevin Memorial Lecture is a special program in the Center for Judaic Studies. Back in 2013, Betsy and Ken Plevin graciously endowed the Jeffrey Plevin Memorial Lecture in Israel Studies to honor the memory of their son, Jeffrey. Jeff graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in History and Judaic Studies. Everyone who worked with Jeff here adored him, really thought the world of him. He was an infectiously upbeat person, endless supply of intellectual curiosity, of enthusiasm, passion for learning, and really a deep, deep love for jazz music, and for Judaism, for Israel, and the University of Arizona. So to remember Jeff and his contributions to Judaic Studies and the University of Plevin, this lecture seeks to honor his memory, continuing interest in the topics that and values that really inspired Jeff. The list of speakers for this series is indeed quite distinguished, and we're very proud of the people we've had in this series. And tonight we're very honored to add Dr. Erika Falk to that list. Now, to give a personal perspective on this, we've asked Jeff's brother to introduce, to say something about Jeff and to begin this series. Rabbi Dr. William Plevin holds a doctorate in religion from Princeton University and has taught Jewish philosophy, theology, and ethics at the Jewish Theological Seminary, at Gratz College, Hebrew Union College, and a variety of other adult educational contexts. He also served for several years as the spiritual leader of Congregation Shaarei Tzedek in Manhattan. Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's a great honor to be a part of this program. It means a lot to us and to my family, my parents, Ken and Betsy, my wife, Sarah, and our son, Ariel, Jeff's immediate family, and to the greater Plevin family and Barish families. It means a lot to have this program run every year. I guess Ed's introduction of me kind of serves as a good point of departure for what I want to say about my brother. As his older brother, I'm his older brother. It's not uncommon to recognize when I was younger that Jeff would do some things to kind of copy me a little bit, as younger brothers are wont to do. And while I often found this, a little bit annoying, a lot of people, people had to tell me, my parents had to tell me that, this is what younger brothers do. And you would think, after hearing Ed's list of my various credentials and professional associations, that like my brother, I was a Jewish studies major. In fact, that is not the case. I was not a Jewish studies major. That was something that Jeff did a little bit differently than me. And I was thinking about that today, in part because I think Jeff really was fascinated by Jewish history in a way that I was less fascinated, and really interested in contemporary Jewish society, contemporary Jewish institutions, the contemporary Jewish world, especially around the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. And it really propelled him into an interest in Jewish philanthropy. He went on to do a master's degree in Jewish studies and Jewish communal service at Gratz College, and propelled him into a career in Jewish communal service and philanthropy. And I think that what's so special about this moment for us as a family, and why we're so grateful to the Jewish Studies Department at the University of Arizona, is that the University of Arizona's Department of Jewish Studies was really a home for Jeff, and not just a place of learning or a place of professional growth, which it was, but really a home, a place that he learned to grow and to thrive. And it couldn't have been done it couldn't have been possible unless it was really a place that was open to having a really inclusive learning environment. And that's something that means a lot to us as well. Jeff was a learner who had a lot of challenges as a learner, and the University of Arizona, as many of you know, is a wonderful place for learners who may struggle in other kinds of settings. If you're familiar with the SALT program at the university, that's a great way to bring in different kinds of learners into the university. And the Jewish Studies department really excelled at making that a home, a learning home for Jeff as well. So it's particularly meaningful to have someone like Dr. Erika Falk speak today about creating inclusive learning in Jewish studies in a variety of different ways. And I'm thinking of that, and we're all thinking of that as an important value in Jeff's life. And we're so grateful that the Jewish Studies Department has helped us continue his legacy through this lecture and in a variety of ways. Thank you very much, and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Bill. That's very touching. As I said, your brother is greatly honored and just admired. He was, a fine young man that we knew him here. And even after he left, he would come back every year. And I know he would come into my office and sit down, and he'd start with the questions. And he was, indefatigable, and he like questioned me like an attorney or something. Maybe that's a benefit from his folks, Betsy and Ken. But always a joy, and it's now a joy for us to be able to continue his legacy in the areas that interest him. So thanks to you and to the family, Betsy and Ken and Sarah, all of you for the things that you do for us here. Now, it is my distinct pleasure, professional honor, to introduce Dr. Erika Falk, who currently serves as the Program Director and Chief Operations Officer of the Israel Institute in Washington, D.C. Now, the Israel Institute promotes Israel studies around the world, and we've had a great relationship with the Israel Institute through the years, and that continues. And Dr. Falk has been a part of that. And it is our great pleasure to have her in this series, really an honor for us. Dr. Falk received her Ph.D. in communication from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and was the founding executive director of the Executive Education Department at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, that she led to success very quickly. Prior to that, she served for 8 years as the program director of the Master of Arts in Communication program at Johns Hopkins. Her first book, Women for President, Media Bias in 9 Campaigns, explores how media cover women candidates. Her second book, Becoming a New Instructor, a guide for college adjuncts and graduate students. That's really a step-by-step manual for new college instructors to learn how to become good teachers, and something that is very important in this day and age as we bring in more faculty. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Falk. Her lecture today addresses the topic of gender inequality in Israel studies. Erika, take it away.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so as I've mentioned, I'm the Program Director and Chief Operating Officer of the Israel Institute, and today I'm going to talk about gender inequality in the academy generally, but also my successes and failures in trying to ensure equal representation of women in grant awards by the Israel Institute and in academic hiring. So let's get started. The Israel Institute, if you're not familiar with us, is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy nonprofit dedicated to expanding rigorous teaching and learning about the modern state of Israel across the United States. Now, we primarily run international academic exchange programs where we Israeli Israeli faculty to teach at American universities. But we also have 2 programs for American academics and students. So let me just mention them briefly, since I suspect there might be many people in the room who would be interested in that. Our first program is called Teaching with Impact, and it's this great program where we bring people from all over the country at all different ranks who teach about the modern state of Israel. And we give them like cutting edge instruction in pedagogy, which most people don't get during their doctoral programs. And then we also use the opportunity to share best practices and come away with a renewed and rejuvenated and updated syllabus for an Israel Studies class. People talk about the program like it's very transformational. So we're on hold now for COVID, but we hope to be planning the next one soon. We also run a program for undergraduate students called our Honors Symposium. And these are grants we give to students, again, 3-day retreat where we bring students from all over the United States together. These are top students at universities all over the country. They don't have to be committed to graduate work in Israel Studies, just interested. And we bring them and we give them like really exciting lectures on like the cutting edge research in Israel Studies, but also like run them through seminars that they might get in graduate school, and then give them instruction on how to find a graduate school, how to get into a good graduate school, et cetera, et cetera. So that's called our Honors Symposium. Now, as Chief Operating Officer of the Israel Institute, I'm also in charge of our safety, respect, equity initiatives. And this came about because I've not always been in the field of Israel studies. Go. So my PhD is actually in political communication. And in graduate school, I came across an interesting piece of research. In 1968, a study was conducted in which college students were asked to rate scholarly articles. And the researcher found that the students tended to rate the articles given women's names of authorships, regardless of the actual gender of the author, as less competent than the same article with a byline of a man. And this study has been replicated many times over the years in many different contexts. So for example, in 1976, Nolan Allen used student editorials as the stimulus for their experiment, and they added ethnic names as an additional variable. They found that articles with feminine or Mexican American names were judged lower in quality than articles attributed with masculine or Caucasians names. Keeping in mind, right, the article is the same, the CV is the same, they're just swapping out the names. Now, all of this led me to start thinking about media bias or gender bias in society at large, and specifically in the media. And I ended up writing a book about women who run for president. And in this book, I examined the amount and type of press coverage of 9 women who ran for president and compared it to the coverage of the 9 most equivalent men running in the same races, where equivalence in this case was measured by polling or vote totals. And just to give you an example of the kind of findings that I discovered, for every 1 article written about a woman candidate, 2 articles were written about a man candidate who polled about the same. So, and just to give you another example, in those articles, the man candidates had more of their issue positions written about than for the women articles. Now, these races took place between Victoria Woodhull's 1872 campaign and Clinton's 2008 campaign. So it was a historical study. And what I expected to find is there would be this, wide disparity in coverage in the 1800s. And then right over time, you would see those 2 lines converge. I mean, maybe not getting to equality in 2008, but I assumed the differences would be much less. But that's not what I found. What I actually found was it was a little bit more like this. The trend lines remained flat. In any specific race, the differences might be a little bit less or a little bit more. Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit here, but I wanted to give you a sense of the research that demonstrates the ways in which cultural bias affects women in society at large. Because before we can kind of understand what goes on in Israel studies, we have to understand the context. Okay, so what does this have to do with gender inequality in academy? the academy. Turns out the story is quite similar. The studies that were conducted in the 60s and 70s that tried to measure bias in evaluations of women have been replicated more recently in academic settings. So for example, in 1999, academic hiring committees were sent a CV that came from a real-life academic, but the name was changed to be either a traditionally masculine or traditionally feminine name. And then the academics who rated the resumes, they were both men and women. They were more likely to vote to hire the applicant when a man's name was at the top of the CV. The same CV, only the names changed. In fact, the researchers found that a CV with a man's name on top was 1.5 times more likely to be recommended than the same CV with a woman's name. And this study was replicated again in 2012. Yale University scholars found professors at 6 major research universities were likely to rate a man job candidate as more qualified than a woman candidate, again, even though they were looking at the same resume. So given these findings, you might not be surprised to learn that in 2020, according to the American Association of University Women, women make up a minority of tenure track faculty and just 36% of full professors. And according to a report by Women Working in Academia, women are paid less than men at every faculty rank. Now, some people hypothesize that these disparities are because women scholars are less productive than men. And the thinking goes like this. Women's liberation in the West has been incomplete. And although the doors allowing women access to work have been opened, women have not been liberated from the primary responsibility for home and children. This is called the double burden. Women must work, but they also must take care of the home and children. So perhaps the theory goes they're less productive. But in 2017, a very sophisticated study showed that women's academic productivity was not the problem. Women remain disadvantaged in receiving tenure even after accounting for publication rates. So to summarize, the gender inequality that occurs in society also occurs in the academy. So what about Israel studies? In a research study done by Rachel Harris and Gila Silverman, I understand who was one of the speakers last week, and I believe they used data from 2019, so very current, there are only 4 tenured women faculty in Israel studies in North America, and no women full professors in the United States or Canada. Harris and Silverman also reported that in Israel, there are 40 programs or centers that work in Israel studies, and only 3 are directed by women. If you look at the Association for Israel Studies website, it lists 16 Israel Studies centers in North America. Only 4 are headed by women. And of the 8 named chairs in Israel studies on the site, only 2 are women. And as we think about these numbers, we should note that women have been earning the majority of doctoral degrees in the social sciences and the humanities since 2008. So, does gender inequality exist in society? Yes. In the academy? Yes. And in Israel studies? Yes. The more interesting question is what can be done about it? And maybe it's the more difficult question too. And so I'm going to use the rest of my time to talk about some of the efforts we've tried, successes and failures in this regard at the Israel Institute. Okay, so after I had been on the job for about a year, I got a call from Rachel Harris. I just mentioned some of the research she was doing with Gila Silverman. And she told me, I'm working on this paper in Israel studies, and I've just been to your website, and I've been at your website, which by the way looks a bit, at that time, looked a bit like this slide. no grant awards have gone to women. I was so embarrassed. I mean, I just spent 15 years publishing and researching about gender inequality. How could I not have noticed this? But I was inspired by her call, and I realized that we needed data. So even without going any further, we've just learned our first lesson, which is that people manage what they measure. In other words, the first step in trying to mitigate gender inequality is collecting data, measuring, and then actually we had the data. It's just that nobody was looking at it. So monitoring. So it's not enough to measure. Somebody actually also has to monitor to make sure you're meeting your goals. And then once we had the data and I was monitoring it, I found that it wasn't exactly true that none of our awards had gone to men, but it was clear there were some problems. And by analyzing the data, I knew exactly where they were. So next, I'm going to talk about where those problems were, the 3 case studies where I did find problems, and then the things we put into place to try to address them. So one of our grant programs is called international grants, and these grants are given to Israeli scholars. They have to be employed at Israeli colleges and universities, and then they go abroad, not to Israel, not to the United States or North America, but somewhere else in the world to teach about Israel at colleges and universities. And this was the first grant program that I identified as having a problem. Okay. So as you can see from the yellow highlights, in 1718 and 1819, no women had been awarded an international grant. But the data revealed something else that was interesting. Notice the highlighted blue cells. We were not getting any applicants from women. So I had a colleague who was in charge of this program, and I called him into my office and I asked him, tell me about the process you're using for soliciting applications. After all, how strange, no women have applied. And he told me, there's no formal process. It's just like a website, and people know about the grants through word of mouth. So what was happening? One man got the grant, I'm imagining, and told another, and so on and so on. And over 2 years, not a single woman had applied. And of course, because we were not monitoring, we were not aware of it. So, oops, there we go. So the solution seemed partially obvious, right? We had to widely advertise the position. Notice what I'm doing here. We had to muster applications for women. So in 1920, we broadly disseminated information about the grant program for the first time. And more than that, we created a list of prominent Israeli academics and made sure they were aware of this grant program, the application process, and the grant awards. And then we ran an ad in Facebook using the Hebrew feminine generic to try to attract Israeli women to apply to this program. And it worked. In 1920, we went from 0 applicants who were women to 26%. And in 2021, it went up again to 29%. Now, that might seem low. 29% of our applicants are women, until you start to think about what's the reference category. These international grants draw from people who are employed at Israeli colleges and universities. So the population of that these grants need to be drawing from, or what we call the reference category, is Israeli faculty. Now, it turns out it's a bit hard to find good data on Israeli higher education and gender balance. But in 2017, the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute released a report that showed women constitute 27% of the senior faculty at Israeli colleges and universities. Okay, so if 27% of our applicants were women, and they had to come from Israeli colleges and universities, we were actually hitting our target. Now, none of this says anything about addressing the underrepresentation of women in Israeli colleges and universities, but one step at a time. So you can see we're starting to build a model for a response, and we've only even looked at one case. We have to measure and collect the data. We have to monitor and then be vigilant about analyzing the data and acting on it. And then we have to make sure we muster the applications for women. Okay, so now let's take case study number 2, teaching expansion grants. These grants are given to Israel Studies centers to help them hire postdoc, contract, and adjuncts to teach Israel Studies courses. Now, these grants are given directly to the universities, and the universities select the candidates. But the universities have to hire someone who can teach at the university, and that means someone with a Ph.D. And because it's Israel Studies, almost all of these scholars are in the social sciences or the humanities. So the people hired with these grants are people who have finished their degrees in the preceding 5 years in social sciences and the humanities. Now, to understand why the data in the final column reflect a problem, again, we have to talk about the reference category. In this case, it's not Israeli women who have positions at colleges and universities in Israel, but Americans holding a PhD in the humanities or social science, because that represents the hiring pool. And for the last 10 years or so, about 60% of the social and behavioral science doctorates have gone to women, and just over 50% in the humanities have gone to women. Yet only 25% of the people hired by these grants were women. Clearly a problem. So what is the solution? It wasn't a problem with applications in this case. So in 2021, we mandated that universities receiving teaching expansion grants had to make the awards to men and women equally. I'm excited to say that we just got our first semester of data in from the fall of 2020, and 60% of the awards were made to women. So we went from 25% of the awards to 60% of the awards in a single year. All right, so now we can add another tool in our toolkit of M's: measure, monitor, muster women applications, and then mandate equality. 2 successes. Now let's talk about the program, which we're still struggling with. Our third program, and our final case study here, is our Teaching Fellow program. These grants fund multi-year teaching placements at universities in the United States, and applicants are Israeli scholars at the postdoc level. So given my experience with the other program, I looked up the data on applications before I looked at anything else. And in year 1, 38% of the applicants were women. And in year 2, 39% were women. And in year 3, 44% were women. So I knew we were already hitting our mark with regards to applications and the reference category. But what about placements? In year 1, we had 3 awards, 0 women. In year 2, we made 2 awards, 0 women. In year 3, we made 4 awards, 1 woman. But these awards are 3-year awards. So after 3 years, we had 9 teaching fellows, only 1 of whom was a woman. And remember, this is at a time when even Israeli faculty are hitting like 40%, high 30%. Okay. But there were 2 challenges. In this case, mandate wouldn't work. We don't select the candidate, the university does. And unlike the teaching expansion grants where they're selecting a panel of candidates, each university only gets 1. So we can't say you have to make the awards equally. And this is where it gets really interesting. So let me talk about 2 case studies, 2 incidents within our Teaching Fellow program, which I think begin to paint a picture about what's going on. I was working with a large public university in the Southwest, and because we had this 3 years of legacy where I knew hiring of women was a problem, I actually had an initial conversation with the hiring manager, and I talked explicitly about the problem that we had identified in that the universities seemed to disproportionately favor men. And he wholeheartedly agreed it was a problem. And great. So I sent him 7 qualified women candidates, keeping in mind that the school is also encouraged to recruit their own candidates. Now, all of the candidates I sent met the minimum qualifications, which meant they had either written a dissertation or had publications on the modern state of Israel. They had a demonstrated ability to teach a wide variety of courses about Israel and strong English skills. Now, there was a committee. There were men and women on the committee, and they rejected all 7 women candidates, saying that not that anything was wrong with those candidates, but that they had found a better candidate. So they sent us his resume and we interviewed him. And he was Israeli and his English was quite good, but Israel was not the subject of his dissertation. And he had not published anything about Israel. And in fact, he had no teaching experience about Israel. So I was a little perplexed, right? I mean, didn't seem to meet the minimum qualifications that we had established in conjunction with the school. So I called the hiring manager and I asked him, can you explain to me how the committee determined that none of the women who did meet the minimum qualifications, why were all of them deemed unqualified, but the one man you selected who did not meet the minimum qualifications was deemed qualified? And there was silence on the phone. I mean, he could not explain it. And to his credit, as soon as I framed it that way, he was actually really embarrassed. And to this day, I mean, this was about a year ago, I find this to be a mind-blowing experience that I can't explain, other than to chalk it up to unconscious bias, which I'm going to talk more about in a second. But first, let me talk about one other case study. This was a different, also a large public research university in the Midwest. And again, given the legacy of problems, I spoke with the hiring manager. I gave the equity talk. We sent 9 qualified women. And he called me back and said he had looked over the resumes and was planning to interview 2 people that we had sent over, both of them men. Why those 2 people? I asked him. I decided I want candidates with a degree in political science, he said. Okay, but one of the 2 men you selected has a degree in history. But I think he can do it, he said. Okay, then why are you not interviewing the 2 women that we sent you who also have a degree in political science? They seem overqualified, he said. I don't think they'll come here. So there's something really interesting here. So for the men, it was, I think they can do it. And for the women, it was, I don't think the fit's right. I don't think they're going to come here. And let me be absolutely explicit about this. This hiring manager, both of these hiring managers were great guys. And I actually don't think they were sexist in any overt or conscious way. In fact, in all of this experience I've had with all of these schools, I've never once met a hiring manager that I thought was consciously sexist. I mean, actually, on the contrary, to a person, they've all fully bought into the idea of hiring on merit, fully acknowledge the institutionalized sexism and the legacy that we have inherited. And they understand it's a continuing problem that they want to address, and including these 2 guys who are this case studies where I just told you about. I mean, this makes me feel like this is really quite a complex and intractable challenge. So let's talk a little bit about implicit bias. The implicit association test for gender and career attempts to measure how strongly people subconsciously associate women with family and men with careers. And the way it works is that a computer program flashes a name or word and asks you to categorize it. So it'll either be a typical name for a man or a word associated with career. And if it's a typical name for a man or a word associated with career, the subject hits a key with their left hand. And if it's a woman, a name associated with a woman or associated with family, the subject like touches a key with the right hand. Okay, so Mark, man name, left key. Corporation, career, left key. Linda, woman, right key. Kitchen, family, right key. And it's all very, very easy, and you can go really fast. Boom, boom, boom. The whole time you're doing this, the computer is measuring the length of the delay between when you see the word or when it flashes the word and when you hit the key, until you get to the final phase. And this is what happens. Get mine up here. The program begins to put man names and family things together on the left side, and woman names and career things together on the right side. So now you really have to think, okay, David, man, left key, but also housework, family, left key. Jessica, woman, right key, but also entrepreneur, career, right key. And suddenly the words are flashing and your mind creaks to a halt and you can feel it slow down. And in that difficulty of association and in that delay in response, the researchers argue is how we measure implicit bias, the way in which our minds unconsciously associate men with careers and women with family. Now, I've spent my whole career, I mean, much of it anyway, researching, gender bias. And I tested just as high on this implicit bias as anybody else. And, if you want to go to the website and take these tests, they're wonderful. And they're also tests for other types of cultural biases. Now, pragmatically, I'm not sure where thinking about and measuring unconscious bias leaves us in terms of actionable advice. It's really quite demoralizing, actually, but it does suggest a few things. When I speak with a hiring manager about equity issues, often the first thing he does is say, oh, yes, it's important. I'm going to put women on the search committee. And don't get me wrong. We absolutely should have women on the search committee. But because women are likely to also hold these unconscious biases and prejudices, putting women on the search committee is just not enough. Now, the other solution that the IAT also kind of suggests is this idea of masking gender through a blind review of resumes and cover letters. That is to say that somebody goes in and takes off all the information that identifies the gender of the candidate before the committee reviews the CVs. What we learned from the IAT is this should help us reduce our unconscious bias when determining whom to interview. Now, you might know that US orchestras made exactly this change in hiring practices in the 1970s. Up until that time, there were very few women who played professionally. And then the orchestras adopted this blind review. And so they would set up a screen. The person making the audition would play their piece behind the screen. So the evaluators had no idea of the identity of the person who was playing. And in the few years after the orchestras began adopting this blind review process, the percent of women musicians in the 5 highest ranked orchestras in the nation increased from 6% to 21%. So this kind of masking of gender, I also have come to believe, is critical, particularly in the preliminary screening of applications in the academic environment. What I can't quite figure out is how to put this in place for job talks. I mean, that's really a profound problem. So again, I haven't got all the answers. I've just come up with a few things. I've made a model here for some tools that work, but I know it doesn't get us all the way there. I'm talking about the Israel Institute, when we were not measuring and monitoring the gender distribution of our grant awards, we were not aware of the problem. And I would say the same for any search. As we began to measure and monitor, we began to manage our bias more effectively. And as part of managing this bias, we realized we needed to muster more applications from women, and that adding women applicants to the pool also increased the number of women who were hired, or in this case, received grants awards. And another strategy we used was mandating equality, where we just went in and said, you got to give these awards equally to men and women. And finally, I've come to realize that this implicit bias against women in society and in academic hiring is difficult, and we need to increase the masking as much as possible. Anyway, that's what we've come up with so far at the Israel Institute. But as I mentioned, we're still struggling. And so I really want to open it up to you all. And I'd love to start with the following question. What do we need to do to achieve parity in representation of women in Israel studies? And with that, I hand it back to Ed, who I think is going to facilitate the discussion.
Sure, I'll be happy to. We have a few questions already, and I'll just start with that. Now, if you want to ask a question, please go into the Q&A or the chat section. I'm monitoring both, and some people are sending me texts as well. So I've got a few screens in front of me, and we'll try to get through those. First question, what data do we have on women who enter PhD programs in Israel studies, complete those programs, and then find employment of some kind? Or is there data? I would assume if it's available, you would have it at the Israel Institute.
What percent of women who complete programs in Israel studies find employment?
Yeah, well, the question is, do we have how many enter, how many complete? In other words, is there a dropout? I assume that's what the question is. And then what percentage of those who make it through find employment?
This is a great question.
You
know, I wonder, Ed, if you're actually more, do you have a PhD program at Arizona?
Not in Israel studies, no.
Oh, not in Israel studies. There really aren't that many. So just to be clear, there are very few PhD programs in Israel studies. Most people who work in the field of Israel studies come either through political science, history, or sociology. And I don't have this at the top of my tongue, but we do know that the majority of PhDs awarded in the humanities and the social sciences go to women. It's higher in the social sciences, closer to 60%. But we also know, and again, I don't have this data on the tip of my finger, that the percent of people who start doctoral programs and complete them is low. And I'm sorry, I just don't deal with that data all the time. And there might even be someone in the room who could help us out who's more familiar with that, and who might be familiar whether there's a disproportionate dropout rate for women. Just because the majority of the degrees are now going to women, and they have been for the last 10 years, I doubt there's a greater dropout rate for women, although there might be. So let us know, put it in the chat.
Okay. Here's another question. How does race factor into Israel studies?
Yeah, so this is actually a really complicated question. Generally speaking, the issues that women face in the academy are amplified for people of color. So I don't have exact data on this because the great majority of the people we give grants to are Israeli, and the great majority of Israelis are white. I shouldn't say that, man. People are gonna be pissed. Okay, no, they're very complicated whether they're white or not, but they would register as white in a typical American context, even though I understand that there's Mizrahi, but they're also underrepresented in Israeli higher education. So I don't have a simple answer to that, but it's take everything that's complicated about women, more complicated for people of color.
Okay. How do you deal with the good old boy network? People hiring other people they know and have worked with, etc.
Yeah, it's really a problem. I think this was exactly the problem that we were dealing with our word of mouth. I can also tell you at the Israel Institute, we frequently get requests from like center directors, and they'll say something like, I have this great person, can you help me find funding for him? But it's almost always a him. I mean, I don't have the answer to this. That's why I really I feel like we have to share best practices. But the more we've become aware of the problem, the more we've started to say to people, we'll be happy to try to help you out. Why don't you send us a couple of candidates who are men and candidates who are women, so that we can choose from them rather than just giving us a single candidate that you want to promote. I also think there's lots of really good listservs out there, like on Facebook, there's Women in Israel Studies, there's JAMA. Women have begun to really try to network a lot better. I had a colleague when I was early in my career, and she told me, Erika, we had published a few articles together. Let's take all of the articles that we've published in the top journals and let's send them to the leading scholars. And I was like, what? Can't do that. And she was like, no, the men do that all the time. Don't be embarrassed. You have to promote yourself. And I really feel grateful to her that she kind of understood that we had to promote ourselves. And I think a lot of women have that challenge.
Okay. What do we lose by not having women in leading positions in Israel studies?
Well, I guess think of it this way. If you assume that the most qualified candidates are always equally distributed between men and women, I mean, granted, it's a premise, but maybe not such a hard one to accept. And then you disproportionately disqualify or underrate the women, then for certain, you're not getting the most qualified candidates. I mean, most of my early work was on the presidency, right? And if you figure in any given year, the best candidates are equally men and women. And if we only consider men for the job, then we're not considering who are the best candidates. And we've cheated ourselves of that, both in terms of scholarship, but also in terms of administration and mentorship. We've just lost it's sad for our society. We've lost some of the best people.
Okay. I'm going to ask Ryan Suarez to repost his question. I inadvertently deleted it when I went to delete one of the ones you answered. So Ryan, if you will go ahead and repost that, I'll read it. It was a great question. My mistake, accidentally hit the wrong button. Is it appropriate and or legal to prefer a female candidate from the outset?
In terms of political science, I suppose. That's a really complicated question. I think that's up to any individual. There are really interesting studies about how people look at candidates. So, for example, women aren't undervalued in every aspect. So often people assume that women are better candidates in education, for example, in education policy, but they assume they're worse candidates in national security, for example. I tend to be very skeptical of any kind of generalizations like that. I mean, for myself. So I think I probably wouldn't, in terms of looking at a candidate's qualities and how good a leader they're going to be, and if they disagree or agree with me on the issues, I probably tend to would not favor a woman as a matter of common practice. However, I'm also very aware of the positive effect of role modeling. And I do think it is very important for girls and all kinds of people to see women in leadership roles. And then those women can mentor other women. And so I do think that, given the state of current inequality, I think an argument could be made for preferring women at least until we get to the point of equality.
Great. Here, thank you, Ryan, for reposting. Here's his question. Do we see inequalities and stats apply only to cis women, or do we see the same biases replicated as applied to trans individuals or female identifying persons? Do we see any difference between the two demographics as far as disparity is concerned in the academy?
I would be very surprised if you didn't. I just don't have the data on that. And maybe somebody else does who can post and share with everybody.
Okay, I think that completes the questions that I have here. Let me just make sure I'm checking all the places. Yep, that's it. So, Erika, thank you very much. I think one of the things, I want to say two things. First of all, thank you for a great presentation. And thank you for taking the time to join us for this, for us, a very important lecture. And we enjoy very much the input you've given us. I also want to say thank you to the Israel Institute for its many years of support and continuing support. I sent an email to Erika earlier this week, thanking the Israel Institute for supporting a course development grant for an Israel Studies course at the U of A by Professors David Gracebort and Leonard Hammer. And the proposal is really outstanding, so I'm glad you all were pleased with it as well. We're just getting another question here. I don't want to miss it. If you can see that question, the last one under the Q&A, that's just a thank you note to you.
Oh, okay, gotcha, gotcha.
From one of our dear colleagues, Beth.
I think there's some questions in the chat too.
Oh, okay. You can see those.
Okay, wait, we did that one. Oh, so it's interesting. Somebody's asking about the hiring managers. Yeah, I've actually, they're disproportionately men, but they're not all men. And again, like, I really don't, I mean, my gut on this is that, like, it's just a mistake to think that these kind of unconscious biases are the plague of men. Like, I really do think we all, they inhabit all of us. And so I've seen the same pattern with women managers, hiring managers.
Oh, somebody's, Stuart Berger's asking for the site for the test.
Oh, you know what? I don't know I don't know the URL, but if you Google IAT, which let's see.
Actually, Sarah Shapiro-Plevin has actually answered that for us. The IAT is available. If you go, everyone, if you go to the chat section, you should be able to see that.
Ah, great.
Implicit.harvard.edu.
Yeah, it's wild. I really encourage you to take it. Like, you will look at yourself in a new way.
I think that covers everything now, if I've got all my screens taken care of. So again, thank you. Thank you for this presentation. And again, also thank you for your part in the Israel Institute support of Israel Studies at the U of A. And we hope to continue to have success together. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. Your participation is important to us. And as you'll see in our spring series, we have several lectures coming up. If you've got information for this, you'll get information for that. And those will run through into May. So we'll be doing every week or two some lectures, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. So Erika, thank you. And thank everyone for joining us. Goodbye.